All the front axle parts are here. So in this video, we're gonna pull the axle, we're gonna re-gear it, we're gonna put gussets on it, we're gonna just generally upgrade it with chromoly and a bunch of other stuff. And we also are gonna change the control arms when it goes back on. Now before we get to any of that, we need to do a quick articulation test. When the suspension compresses straight, like going over a straight speed bump or going off a jump straight or something like that, the tire's not gonna hit this, at least not much at all. But when we start to flex and the axle gets all at a big angle, it may rub onto something up here or something like that that we're not aware of. So we're gonna go across the street, flex it out, see what happens. Let's get started. So here it is, pretty much fully flexed out as much as it can with the current suspension setup. We've got just enough clearance for the wheel to turn here. We've got a little gap up there just above the tire, just for safety. And then down here you can see, indeed, the bump stop is not fully compressed. Now I just gotta measure that, mark it down for later, and then we'll get this thing out of here. And the neighbors will stop looking at me funny. The back looks pretty darn good too. Okay, I took some measurements real quickly and then I got it out of there so it didn't look like I crashed anymore. And the results are in. In the front, we're going to have to add an inch to this right here so that the bump stop has 3.5 inches of up travel. Now, I know that's half an inch less than the recommended and the factory spec, but I think it'll do in the circumstances, and this is the suspension that we've got. Now the back was basically spot on perfect, so there may have actually been a little too much bump stop when we had the 32-inch tires on here. So all in all, the sacrifices that we have to make really aren't that bad for a Jeep with this lift kit height, this whole low center of gravity thing. I know this doesn't mean it's the same way for every Jeep, but for mine, 3 washers on each of the steering stops and a little bump stop raise, it's not a big deal. Enough jibber jabber, let's jack it up and get ready to pull the front axle. Now we can remove all the things that aren't critical to holding the axle in place, like the drive shaft, the brake lines, shocks, sway bar links, tie rod, steering stabilizer, and a few other little bits. Now it's time to remove the panhard rod and the control arms, and this whole thing will be free. All the bolts are out and everything is disconnected. Now we gotta try to get this axle onto those jack stands over there. Now the next order of business is going to be to get the brakes off both sides, as well as pull the axle shafts out, get the hub bearings unbolted, all that stuff on the outer end. Then we'll put some gussets on different parts of the axle here on some of the brackets, and we'll add some bump stop extensions to these pads right here. Now the bearing is sticking on there. Maybe the other one will be better. The unit bearings were very stubborn, but they are out now along with the axle shafts. As for gussets, we've got some C gussets for the knuckles here. We've got an upper control arm gusset for the super skinny bracket that's on the axle on top. We've got 2 lower control arm bracket gussets here for sliding along off-road. We've also got some material here to raise the bump stops. Then over here, I've got this piece of scrap that I'm going to use to make axle tube to diff gusset. So I couldn't really find anything on the internet that I wanted. Luckily, it seems like somebody somewhere has jumped this Jeep in the past, so there's a lot of extra rubber left on these little towers, so we know exactly where to put the bump stop extensions here. Gotta be really careful here not to melt this bushing. Just trying out a bit of CAD, cardboard aided design here. Now that all the weld-on stuff is fabbed up and stuck on, let's clean up our area and start getting the diff pulled apart. Then we'll get all the parts laid out on the table and get some of the new ones out of their boxes too. The diff is now all emptied out. Up here on the table, we've got our old carrier and pinion just here. New locker, Detroit style, 488 gears and all the other little bits to go with them. First thing we need to do, pull these 3 old bearings off with the puller, turn them into setup bearings, and then we can get the whole thing set up, mocked up, and put in. This bearing actually has some significant damage. Good thing we don't have to reuse it. All right, the carrier and pinion shaft are fully set up. They're in there, they're fully torqued up, they're done. Now we need to put the diff cover on, and then maybe we'll knock a little bit of this excess grease and dirt and these deposits off of there. Then we'll give it a paint job. Now while the axle dries, let's swap out these control arms with the new ones. new control arms are in and set to the same length as the others. We may correct some geometry in the future, but for now that'll work just fine. Back to the axle, which is now dry. We've got the brakes and the shafts and the hub bearings that need to go back on, as well as put some fluid in the diff. These new chromoly shafts should be plenty strong enough for the 35s. Now I am aware that it's recommended that you switch to different brakes when you're doing 35s on a TJ, but when I moved it across the street there, moved it, 10, 15, 20 miles per hour, it didn't seem that bad, so it's something I'm just gonna play by ear, and they're easy to switch out later when the axles are on the Jeep and everything's back to normal. The axle is all buttoned up, everything's on it. Now let's put it back on the Jeep and get everything reconnected. The axle is fully bolted back on, everything is reconnected, checked and double checked. Now we just gotta bleed the brakes and then throw the wheels and tires on it. Thank you so much for watching. Front axle is all on there, it's all done. In the next video, we're gonna do the rear axle.